Hi there, my name is Dr. Celina Phillips, and I'm a faculty member at Chico State College of Agriculture. And I have developed some Google Sheet ration formulation spreadsheets that I am sharing and that can be used namely as an educational tool. These are designed to introduce students to the concepts of ration formulation with minimal complexity. And generally, we're only going to be balancing for possibly 4 nutrients at a time. Things such as energy, protein, calcium, and phosphorus. Those are the big ones. And so it's a very simplified form, but a great starting point in learning how to do some basic ration formulation. Today, I'm going to introduce our swine ration formulator. And the first thing, because this is a shared Google folder, the first thing that I'm going to ask everybody to do when they open it up is first make a copy of the spreadsheet. So to make a copy, you're simply going to go up to the top menu on your Google Sheet and select File. Once you've selected File, still thinking, you're going to select Make a Copy. And when you do that, it's going to make a copy of this spreadsheet, and it should give you the option to put it into a different folder. So what I ask is that you move it out of this folder to somewhere that you have your other documents. So for example, I have a working copy of the same folder for me, and that's where I'm going to choose to save it in my copy. And once you've done that, now you've got a duplicate, and that's going to preserve the integrity of my original file. And plus, this will give you a chance to save your work. Now, you can copy this as many times as you need. So if you're working on one ration and you just want to save it as that ration, you could do a file save as, make a copy, work on that ration. And you can also now go in and change the title. So I could change this title to, find my keyboard. Celina's. Whoops. So my version of this ration formulator. And that way you know that you have a clean copy that you're working with. And so the first sheet that should open up for you is the instructions page. So a spreadsheet is generally considered a workbook, and within it are worksheets. And so in my ration formulators, there are generally 4 to 5 worksheets. The first one that you should always review is the instructions page. It gives a synopsis of what the other sheets provide and will entail. One thing I do want to make clear is that this spreadsheet is designed for educational purposes. It does not replace a nutritionist. It does not override any other nutritional knowledge. It is simply an educational tool that can be used to introduce basic concepts of ration formulation. That's my disclaimer. Again, I ask that you make a copy and move it to another folder before using. Now, with this swine spreadsheet, I do want to provide where my reference information all came from, and all the data I've compiled and abbreviated a bit, but used the Nutrient Requirements for Swine, the 11th edition from 2012, that is published by the National Research Council of the National Academies of Science. And so with that, let's get into the nuts and bolts of the 4 pages, or the 4 sheets within this. The first is the Formulate screen. And you'll notice that along the bottom of your Google Sheet, you will see Formulate, Requirements, Feed Table, and Batch Mixing. Those are the 4 sheets that you have access to. The Formulate is the main diet formulation page where you're going to enter most of your data. The other pages are going to be more reference information than data. It's where you're going to find your information. The Requirements is summarized from the Swine NRC publication I mentioned earlier and represents the various classes of swine that you may be feeding. For example, nursery pigs, growing pigs, finishing pigs, gestation, lactation. What we're going to focus on in this Formulate sheet in this spreadsheet is to focus on balancing swine rations for lysine, phosphorus, and calcium. Lysine is the first limiting nutrient or amino acid for swine production because corn is actually very low in lysine. And then the two major minerals needed in the highest quantity are phosphorus and calcium. So that's what we're going to work towards, is getting a ration to fit the parameters for lysine, phosphorus, and calcium. There's a feed table sheet that we'll get into, as well as the batch mixing. But first, let's just kind of jump into this, and I took some notes so I have a cheat sheet here. And we're going to start with the formulate page. So once you select the formulate page, you'll see that there's different colored cells. My spreadsheets are set up that you will enter data into the white cells. Any other colored cells are either no information or protected formulas. And so when we're balancing rations, there's a couple things of basic knowledge that we need to have. The first is, what's our animal that we're feeding? What is our animal type? And we need to understand the stage of production and all of those parameters so we can estimate the requirements for that class of animal. So to do that, you'll notice that right here in cell B3, I have a white box. That's where you're going to input the data. And if you notice the black triangle over the corner of it, that if you highlight the cell, a note pops up. And it's going to tell us to look up the class of animal that we're feeding in the requirements spreadsheet, or the requirements sheet, and find the one we're working with and enter that code into this box. It will populate the requirement cells. So let's do that. So if we come into the requirements sheet, which is the next tab on the bottom of the workbook, you will see about 8 classes of swine that have been summarized from the swine NRC. And so we're going to select whatever one that you're closest to dealing with. For example, say we had some growing pigs that were weighing about 120 to 130 pounds, and they were mixed gender, meaning barrows and gilts mixed together. If that's the case, then we would select animal ID number 5, growing pigs, 110 to 165 pounds. So once we know our animal ID code, we're going to bring that back to the formulate screen. Enter the code and give it a second, and you should see the lysine requirement, the phosphorus requirement, and the calcium requirement populate. Okay, those are taken directly from that requirements sheet, and they automatically populate, so you don't have to enter any of the data. The spreadsheet's going to look it up for you. So just to confirm and show you where those numbers are coming from, what it's doing is in this selection of animal 5, it's pulling in the lysine percentage and the calcium and phosphorus percentages for this group of pigs to consume. And so like 0.97, if we go back to the formulate screen, that's what it has for us. So it's just bringing in that data so we know what we're balancing for. The second thing we're going to do is just enter a descriptive name. Celina's growing pig ration. Whatever you want to call it, it'll help you, and you can save these files or print them out so that you've got it. All right, so that first piece of information that you need for ration formulation is being able to describe your animal and get to the nutrient requirements. So we've got to know what the animal's bringing in. Now, the second part of building good rations is to know what the feeds are supplying and what feeds we have available. And so in my formulators, there are 2 categories. You have either your variable ingredients, which are the first 4, or you can add some fixed ingredients as well. The reason I have variable ingredients is we're going to select a predominant energy source, a protein source, a phosphorus and calcium source, and let the spreadsheet solve for the optimal combination. Most swine diets are going to be a corn-based diet. Generally, soybean meal is going to be the protein source. And you can usually use a dicalcium phosphate or a monocalcium phosphate, depending on what you have available, as your phosphorus source. And then generally limestone is added if calcium's needed above that. So in order for this spreadsheet to work, we do have to populate all 4 of these categories. Okay? They might give us a 0 over here, but in order for the spreadsheet to work, we've got to have all 4. So we're going to look up some more codes. If we go to the feed table, we're going to find corn. And in this feed table, I've got things in alphabetical order. So if you come down here, CCC, corn, yellow dent, that's going to be the grain. One way to verify this is if you've learned the international feed numbering categories 1 through 8, you'll see that this is a category 4 feed, which means it is the energy feed. So we're simply going to enter 17 for corn as our grain and energy source. Now you're going to see negative numbers. That's because it's doing its thing, but you have to have all 4 feeds in first before you accept the solution. Our protein source is going to be soybean meal. If we go back to the feed table and scroll down to the S's, there's several different soybean meals. We're going to use feed number 49, which is a dehulled solvent extracted. So let's put 49 in as the protein source, and you'll see the numbers start changing. We need a phosphorus source. I typically use dical in my example formulations because it's very common. And so dicalcium phosphate is number 19. And if we were going to look up, oops, that's requirements, ground limestone, limestone is number 25 right here. So let's enter number 25. All right. Now that we have all 4 feeds entered into the spreadsheet, then we can start looking to see how close we truly are. So if you take a look, and most swine rations are going to be balanced on a protein basis first because they're already high energy, so we don't necessarily have to balance for energy. When we do ruminant rations, we do need to balance for energy because they're on high forage diets, which can be limiting in calories. So if we take a look at the big 3 that we were balancing for, lysine is 0.98, calcium is 0.64, and phosphorus is 0.53. And so we have a calcium phosphorus ratio of 1.2. Let's look at our requirements. And we are at least meeting at the minimum level all of our requirements. So this ration would be acceptable. And one thing to pay attention to is this calcium phosphorus ratio. Generally, you always want it at least probably 1.1 or greater. You just never want phosphorus higher than calcium because that can produce some problems. So as a general rule of thumb. All right, so that's it. That balanced ration for these growing pigs. Now, say if we wanted to put in a fixed ingredient, say we're using bakery waste to cheapen up our corn costs or something like that and reduce costs. If we go to the feed table, we can find bakery meal. That's the bakery waste. It's an energy feed. Say I want to use some of that. Okay, let's put in feed number 3 in this area down here called fixed ingredients. Now, our ration always has to equal 100 right here. And you'll see the total, if you scroll down, it's got to equal 100. So say if we want to put in 25% of our ration is going to be this bakery meal. What would it need to do to balance it up? If we select that, you'll see that the proportions of the other ingredients changed to accommodate that. You'll notice it makes it a little bit tougher to get spot on for the lysine. And so we might drop that down to 20% or maybe 15%. But there is an acceptable range. It is going to recalculate it, but it will keep the other things correct. So one thing I will say is that when you use this, you do have to monitor the practicality of it. And this may be something that where we could add lysine as well. See if I have lysine in the feed table. I may not have pure lysine. That's one that we could add. But we may need to do some different things to help meet the needs. But that should give you an idea of how the spreadsheet works and what you can do. Now there's a couple features. I'm going to go ahead and delete out the bakery waste. And go back to our original ration. Now there's a couple things that we could do and make sure we interpret the data properly. So here it's giving us the actual composition of this calculated diet. And as you go down, you'll notice that there's a blank for the ration cost per hundredweight. If you wanted to, you have the flexibility as a user to look up the cost for feeds. So you could come in and put in the cost per 100 pounds. Okay, so you can't put in cost per pound, you cannot put in cost per ton, you have to put in the cost per hundredweight. And so it may take you calculating what that cost per hundred is, but for example, corn could be $10 per hundredweight. We would just type that number in, and then the ration would start using that as part of the calculations. So that's something. And what I'll do is if there's any errors as you work through this, let me know, and I will gladly fix them and post a new copy up in the shared folder. The final sheet that can be useful is the batch mixing sheet. And it automatically copies your ration title in from the Formulate page. You can enter today's date. I think it's 18th, 19th, I don't even know anymore. And say we want to make a 2-ton batch, 4,000 pounds. Just enter your batch size and it's going to give you a couple pieces of information. The first column here is the total pounds in the mix. So we would need just over 2,800 pounds of corn, just over 1,000 pounds of soybean meal, and about 31 pounds of dical and 38 pounds of limestone. Sometimes your equipment actually has a cumulative scale on it so that you would know exactly how much of each ingredient to add without zeroing out the scale. Both are acceptable, but it'll give you whatever batch size you're wanting to do. Say we're wanting to make 500 pound batch. It will adjust for that. So that kind of gives you some background on the spreadsheet. Please remember that this is for educational purposes. Make a copy and move it to another folder before you get started. But hopefully that walks you through a little bit about how to use the spreadsheet.